There is a book almost no one outside a university has ever opened. It was published in 1929 by the University of California Press, and its title is not dramatic. It is one word and a place: Lovelock Cave. Hundreds of pages of lot numbers, soil notes, and basket fragments written to be cited, not read. And in its appendix is a single line about human hair. Not a theory, a measurement. Among the mummified remains recovered from a cave in the Nevada desert, the report records that some of the hair survived and that on certain remains the color of that hair was a distinct reddish tone. The men who wrote it, Llewellyn Loud and Mark Harrington, were not storytellers. They were cataloguers. They were the careful kind. 18 years before that book, in 1911, two miners named David Pugh and James Hart had climbed a crack in the West Humboldt Mountains. They were not looking for the past. They were after something far less romantic. Bat guano. Dried droppings, valuable as fertilizer. They hauled it down by the sack. Roughly 250 tons of it screened on the hillside and shipped to a fertilizer company in San Francisco. And in that guano, 3 to 6 feet deep, were the dead. Baskets, sandals, bodies. One of those miners later wrote that one body, about 4 feet down, had hair that was distinctly red. What they screened away on that hillside, no one would ever measure. What they kept by accident. The order of it, the layers that tell you what came first, was gone before a scientist ever arrived. I started reading about that 1929 report for a completely unrelated reason. A footnote in a study about reed boats. I found this because I was looking for something else entirely. The mainstream account is clear, and it deserves to be stated plainly, because it is largely correct. Lovelock Cave was a shelter used for thousands of years by the ancestors of the northern Paiute on the shore of a lake that has since dried to scrub. The artifacts are real and extraordinary woven duck decoys, sandals, baskets, some dating back more than 2,000 years. The dryness preserved everything. The giants of the headlines are an embellishment, archaeologists say, layered onto a genuine Paiute oral tradition. That tradition is real. The Paiute spoke of an enemy people called the Si-Te-Cah in northern Paiute, 2-liters, named for the marsh reed they wove into rafts, the same reed woven into the decoys in the cave. The Paiute activist Sarah Winnemucca recorded the story in her 1883 book. She wrote of a hated, hostile people who were destroyed not, in her own words, of 10-foot giants. And the size claims have been tested. A University of Nevada analysis in the 1970s concluded the remains were around 6 feet tall for the era, but human. Some bones once attributed to the cave turned out to belong to cattle. The local museum now tells visitors at the door that the red-haired giants are a myth. That account is true as far as it goes, but it is incomplete in ways that matter. Because all of it, every careful conclusion rests on what was left after the miners finished. That is the story. Here is what it leaves out. In 1912, the University of California sent a man named Llewellyn L. Loud to the cave. He was not a trained archaeologist. Almost no one was then. He was an outdoorsman the department trusted to do careful work. He lived at the cave from the 1st of April to the 1st of August. 5 months in the dirt. He recovered roughly 10,000 specimens. But notice the year. The miners began in 1911. Loud arrived in 1912 after the top 3 to 6 feet had already been stripped, screened, and shipped to San Francisco. The miners had dumped the upper layers in a heap outside the cave. They saved only what struck them as interesting. Everything else went down the mountain as fertilizer. So when Loud began, the single most valuable thing an archaeologist owns was already gone. Not the objects. The stratigraphy, the layered order of the soil, the sequence that tells you which century sits above which. Without it, an object is just an object. You cannot say how old or after what. Loud did what he could. He divided the cave into 41 zones he called lots. He mapped them roughly. But he recorded no depth, no volume, because the depth that mattered had already been carried off. His lots covered about 1/8 of the cave. This is the part I keep returning to. The record was not lost in a fire or a vault. It was sieved on a hillside and sold by the ton for fertilizer before the question was even asked. And here is the detail that should have settled the whole legend and instead kept it alive. Among what Loud and later Mark Harrington in 1924 did recover were roughly 45 to 60 sets of human remains, and on some, the surviving hair carried that reddish cast the miners had already described. That should have ended it. It did not. What happened to the record after that is not a single dramatic act. There was no midnight raid, no order from on high. This is not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It was something more durable than a conspiracy. It was convergent interest. Consider who wanted what. A fertilizer company wanted guano and got 250 tons of it. The upper record sold off as a commodity before anyone weighed its value as history. Curio hunters wanted souvenirs, and in the 13 years between the two excavations, with no professional on site, an unknown number of artifacts and even mummies simply walked out of the cave. Newspapers wanted giants, and inflated 6 feet into 10. Each of these served a different interest. None of them needed to coordinate. They only needed to point the same direction. And the institutions that came last did the quietest work of all reframing. The remains that did survive were eventually removed from public display. In the case of the museum in Winnemucca, this was done under NAGPRA, the 1990 federal law requiring museums to return Native American human remains to descendant communities. That is a respectful law. It exists to right an old wrong, but its effect, layered on top of everything else, is total. The bodies are no longer on a shelf where you can go and look. The public record thins to a note and a sign that says myth. The obvious objection is simple. The remains were ordinary people, around 6 feet tall. The red hair is a known effect. Dark hair can oxidize to red-brown over centuries in dry, chemically active ground. The newspapers exaggerated. The cattle bones were a mix-up. That objection is correct, and it is also part of the argument, because if the truth was that mundane, then no one had any incentive to protect the context. The marvelous and the ordinary were screened away together in the same sacks for the same fertilizer. We did not lose the giants. We lost the people, the real, measurable, 2,000-year record of who actually lived there, and we lost them precisely because everyone assumed there was nothing important to lose. The famous version of this story says an institution made the bones vanish. The documented version is duller and far more complete. A commodity, a souvenir trade, a 13-year gap, and a law passed with good intentions. The bones did not vanish. The reasons to keep them in reach simply never aligned. The man at the center of this is not a hero, and he was never celebrated. Llewellyn L. Loud, a museum employee at the University of California, sent to Nevada in 1912, because he was reliable, not because he was famous. He lived alone in that cave for 5 months. He sorted the leftover heap the miners had dumped outside, picking baskets and bone out of discarded fertilizer tailings, item by item. He kept his day job the whole time. When the field season ended, he was supposed to write the report. He worked on it at night, on weekends, year after year. By 1924, 12 years later, it still was not finished. The university finally sent him back to the cave to work alongside Mark Harrington, partly, it seems, to make him complete the thing. The report came out in 1929. Loud's name is first on it. Think about what that meant. He spent the better part of 2 decades trying to reconstruct an order that 2 miners had already shoveled away in a single season. Trying to rebuild from 41 rough zones and 10,000 loose objects, a sequence that had been screened into fertilizer before he ever climbed the hill. He did not complain in print. The report is just careful, quiet, exact. It is the work of a man cataloguing what was left after the important part was already gone. Place Lovelock beside two other entries from the same record, and the shape repeats. In 1931, the Nevada Review miner reported two very large skeletons found in the dry Humboldt Lake bed near Lovelock, one described as roughly 8.5 feet, wrapped in a gum-coated fabric like an Egyptian mummy. The report exists. The skeletons were never scientifically preserved or located. They survive only as a newspaper paragraph. Across the same decades, the American newspaper record is full of these giant skeleton reports from gravel pits and burial mounds, printed, marveled at, and then never confirmed, because nothing was kept. The discovery was the story, the custody was no one's job. And then the modern turn. In the 1990s and 2000s, museums quietly withdrew human remains displays from public view under repatriation law. The Winnemucca Museum says as much itself. The individual cases each have a conventional explanation. Together, they describe something else. Here is where it touches you directly. You can drive 22 miles south of Lovelock today and walk a free BLM boardwalk into that cave. You will see soot on the ceiling and the scars of the digging. You will see exactly 0 artifacts. Everything that came out is elsewhere, or gone, and the upper record, the part that mattered most, was once sold by the ton to a fertilizer company in San Francisco. The most complete account of these people was, briefly, a line item on a shipping invoice. None of these records are hidden. They are simply never placed next to each other and read in sequence. If you want to read them yourself, the Loud collection sits at the Phoebe A. Hearst Museum of Anthropology at UC Berkeley. Some artifacts are at the Humboldt Museum in Winnemucca and the Nevada State Museum. The famous duck decoys went to the Smithsonian. The 1929 report is public. So here is what the documents actually answer. The hair was likely darkened to red by 2,000 years in dry, mineral ground, though the records leave just enough room that some of it may simply have been red. The remains were tall, but human. Sarah Winnemucca wrote of enemies, not giants. The bodies are not destroyed. Most were repatriated, returned to the people they belonged to. That part is not a cover-up. It is closer to a correction. What the documents do not answer is what was in the 3 to 6 feet that left the mountain first. We will never know. It is not in a vault. It is not classified. It became fertilizer. There is one thing you can still check. The 1929 report's appendix describes the hair on specific remains, by lot. That appendix and Loud's catalogue are held with the Loud collection at the Hearst Museum in Berkeley. If you find the lot number for the redhead remains before I do, put it in the comments. If documented, evidence-led history matters to you, subscribe. This channel exists precisely for this work. The miners shipped 250 tons of that cave to San Francisco, and a fertilizer company spread it on the fields. Which means the oldest record of the people who lived at Lovelock is not in any archive at all. It is somewhere in California, in the soil, under the orchards, still,